Chapter 17, Breakfast at the Palace, the metaphor of the wolves and a red epilogue. Lord Melbourne could not remember the last time he had felt so happy and encouraged to embark on a new day. Surely it had been from the time before the appearance of the late Albert in the court of Victoria, in the happy times when he and Victoria were alone, side by side. But his happiness was now so immense, that the happiness he felt at that time when he and Victoria were only friends, in which their mutual romantic attraction should be stifled by duty, was a pale reflection of what he now felt. He had to make an effort not to cut himself while shaving, because his mind was far away, absorbed by the exciting memories of the night of passion he had lived with Victoria. He felt like a teenager, like the happy Brocket Hall kid he had been long before Caro entered his life. A couple of times he laughed at his own nonsense, thinking sarcastically how an older man could become so childish when he fell in love with a girl much younger than him. But blessed nonsense! Some time later, already clean, groomed and dressed in one of his elegant suits, he walked to the dining room where the others were already waiting. There he joined George, Wellington, Leopold, Peel, and Victoria's mother. Lord Melbourne took a seat next to the Duchess, having on his other side the empty chair that presided over the table and waiting for Victoria, who had not yet joined the group waiting for her for breakfast. "Lord Melbourne, how are you today?" Victoria's mother asked with a curious and malicious look. "Very well, thanks for asking, ma'am. In fact, I feel very encouraged this morning," answered Lord Melbourne sincere, with joy and a certain mischief reflected in his eyes. "I'm happy, Lord Melbourne, after yesterday's terrible event. I'm glad you're happy and encouraged. It is time for us to have some happiness in this house. And above all, I want you and Dina to have a happy marriage. It is my greatest wish, Lord Melbourne," said the Duchess in a low tone so that only Lord Melbourne could hear her, with affection and sincerity in her last words. "Thank you very much, Duchess, really," Lord Melbourne replied, also sincere and affectionate. The Duchess smiled and then stopped seeing Lord Melbourne for a moment, to drink a glass of water. Then her face lit up as if she had had an idea. "You know, Lord Melbourne, last night I had a strange dream," said the Duchess trying to sound serious and indifferent. "Really? I'm curious to meet it," replied Lord Melbourne kindly and with some curiosity. "Well, I dreamed of wolves. They were in a forest similar to those I used to walk with my family, in my beloved Coburg, during my childhood. The fact is that there was a young female wolf. You do not ask me how I knew she was a female and also very young, but I knew it. And the young wolf was howling very restless as if she was in heat, and suddenly an old wolf appeared, a male, a very beautiful and strong stallion, and mated with her," said the Duchess with a mocking smile and mischievous look. Lord Melbourne choked on the glass of water he was drinking at that moment and coughed loudly, drawing the attention of the other diners who were at the table. After a few moments he regained his breath and the others returned to chat with each other, while the Duchess smiled amusedly. "In my dream, the wolf howled while the male mated with her, but this time it was a different howl. Call me foolish, but I think it was a howl of pleasure. And when the male finished and retired from her, that beautiful and young female rolled over herself and lay on her back, and I swear that in her snout had a smile of satisfaction and pleasure. In short, a very strange dream, but you already know us the Germans, we are quirky persons with very strange dreams, my dear Lord Melbourne," added the Duchess with a certain sensual and mocking tone, while drinking some more water. Lord Melbourne stared at that woman who until recently seemed so detestable, a true bitter and selfish witch, and suddenly saw her with another light, as if she were a different person. And he was surprised to see that he was beginning to feel sympathy for her, and he could not help but smile. "Now I've discovered something of your late husband, of Victoria's father. I think he was a very lucky man at the end of his life and he had a lot of fun in your company, ma'am," said Lord Melbourne, affectionate and amused, a little playful. "Do you believe, Lord Melbourne? Maybe it's an effect I have on men and that my daughter has inherited," the Duchess replied with some coquettishness, as if she were flirting with her son-in-law, but with a playful touch, like the one used with a platonic friend. I think the old wolves, both females and males, we have a talent for love and pleasure born of experience in hundreds of battles in those slippery terrains, a talent that young wolves in heat can appreciate very well." They both laughed, mischievously and with some complicity, as if they were old friends. Leopold interrupted his conversation with George to see his sisters so cheerful and friendly with Lord Melbourne, and raised an eyebrow and outlined a gesture of surprise and bitter resignation. Definitely, fate had mocked him and his plans, condemning him to see how even his sisters succumbed to the charm of that annoying Lord Melbourne who, instead of leaving their lives, had settled forever in them. Now, the hope of saving even a small part of his plans and his ambitions depended on something as unpredictable, and superfluous in normal families, as the sex of the unborn child. In that situation, they found themselves when Victoria entered the dining room, with all her majestic natural dignity, but perhaps a little more quickly than usual, as if she came with a slight delay to a date. Everyone stood up as the Queen entered the dining room, as dictated by protocol. As soon as she entered, the eyes of Victoria and Lord Melbourne crossed and Victoria's cheeks turned red as tomatoes while her heart was pounding. The charming smile and the look of love that Lord Melbourne directed his wife, made Victoria feel hot inside her body and her skin bristled, while she outlined a sweet smile and a puppy-like look. "Good morning everyone. Mama, Uncle Leopold, Duke, Sir Robert, Lord George," Victoria said, trying to calm down and not sound excited and anxious as she felt after the night of love with her husband, Lord M. She added, shy and flushed when seeing her husband. "I think we already said hello, ma'am, one of the advantages of being the Queen's consort," said Lord Melbourne, looking at her with a look of desire and a mischievous smile. "Certainly, William," Victoria replied, feeling again that her heart was racing, and a little embarrassed to see her mother giggle, and then she turned to see Baroness Lazen arriving in a hurry after lingering a little to give instructions to a maid. "Dear Lazen, take a seat. I have made you all wait for quite some time." Victoria sat down and everyone else did after her. "And if you allow me to say it, Victoria, having the privilege of sharing the night and waking up with you, makes me feel the happiest and most fortunate man in the world. Nothing has given me more pleasure than to wake up with you in my arms," Lord Melbourne whispered in Victoria's ear, in a serious, virile, and sensual voice. Victoria's eyes gleamed and she was so happy and excited that she wanted to get up from the table and return with Lord Melbourne to the bedroom. But the servants began to serve breakfast and soon a lively talk involved everyone. Victoria often saw Lord Melbourne while he talked with the other diners and marvelled at how different he was on social occasions as he was in the privacy of the bed. That happy man, sarcastic and charming but correct with the protocol, that man dressed impeccably, was another very different when he made love to her, displaying his virility shamelessly, showing his lust, behaving like a strong and well-endowed male, hungry for desire. Now that she saw him, as she had seen him so many times before dressed elegantly, she could only remember him as she had seen him in the night and on waking, totally naked like a magnificent savage, like a stallion. Victoria had to calm down and remember that she was in public. But the wonderful and hot new feeling that she felt in her crotch, in her sex, shouted that she wanted to feel him inside her again very soon. And she smiled amused at the thought that this was what the females of all species should feel when they were in heat. "Let us hope that this infamous man will listen to reasons and cease his embarrassing acts, that he will stop attacking my niece," said Leopold in a serious and disgusted tone, referring to Cumberland. Victoria thought that only Uncle Leopold was able to make the atmosphere tense and break her reverie of lustful pleasure, and with a sigh, she recognized inside her mind that what Lord Melbourne had said about her uncles in her outburst of anger was totally true, and maybe he had fallen short. "Well, if that's the case, we always have George ready to hit anyone who needs to hit," said Lord Melbourne, who had seen his wife out of the corner of his eye, and with a joke, he wanted to relax the atmosphere so as not to spoil her happiness. Victoria smiled, as did the rest of the diners with the exception of Leopold, who frowned. "For that, I am not necessary, my dear William. I remind you that you gave the first blow and that once you have made the decision to fight you are much more enthusiastic than me. In fact, that was the way it was in our youth, replied George mocking, challenging to his friend at his own game. Yes, but I do not have as much merit as you. For my shame, I must admit that I faced a man older than me, while you faced not only a man younger than you but also military. And he was willing to challenge you to duel, and I'm sure you would have accepted the challenge, replied Lord Melbourne, following that game in which each underestimated his own merits and exalted that of his friend, but in which both ultimately boasted of virility, as a friendly game between young males, which made Victoria smile. Well, I would have had no choice but to accept the challenge. What would you expect me to do? Replied smiling George, but speaking seriously and sincerely. I do not know, maybe to think that you could leave your little children orphans. Lord Melbourne replied in a tone of affectionate reproach. I think you underestimate my capacity in a duel, William, said George mockingly, with a funny disdain. Of course, the man says that in a simple military training he nailed me a bayonet by mistake, Lord Melbourne replied sarcastically. Honestly, William, I never imagined seeing you hit anyone. I'm used to seeing you as a conciliatory man, even too much to be a politician. But I like to see you can shake a bastard like that. Maybe you would be been a good soldier after all, said the Duke of Wellington, a bit mocking and sarcastic. Don't doubt it, Your Grace. Although William criticizes me, he was very willing to fight a duel with Cumberland. He told it to his face without hesitation, and I'm sure he was serious. No, William, said George, sincere and a bit funny. I'm glad that did not happen. Just thinking about it filled me with anguish. William, you have to promise me that you'll never do such a thing again. You should not unnecessarily put yourself at risk, said Victoria, a little anxious and worried. Don't worry, Victoria. I will not, replied Lord Melbourne, giving his wife a warm look. As long as nobody dares to offend you or hurt you in my presence, he added, lowering his voice so that only she could hear him and then looking away towards the plate. Victoria was moved and excited, and she thought if it would be a sin to wish that at that moment her husband would raise her skirt and he possess her on the dining room table. Well, putting aside the gallant gestures of knights-errant, we must be practical and prepare ourselves, if that scoundrel is not intimidated by threats, said Leopold, arrogant and ill-humoured. Sir, I've had to deal with Cumberland for many more years and worse than you, Wellington said calmly and firmly. Do not forget that I was Prime Minister in the most scandalous and turbulent times of that scoundrel Cumberland life, and I know the old fox well. Certainly, he is a dangerous man, but he is also a devious coward who only attacks treacherously, and knowing that his life and privileges are not at risk, he is capable of attacking in a fit of rage, and from there those crimes come that are attributed to him, but when he is scared he recoils and hides his head like the ostrich. I think the threat of losing everything may force him to give up his nonsense, but of course we must stay alert and not allow ourselves to be caught unawares, he added. In any case, we certainly have to prepare for the worst, expecting the best to happen. I will start working so that we are able to comply with what I threatened Cumberland if necessary. I will not leave anything to chance to ensure that that man leaves Victoria in peace, said Lord Melbourne, decided. Victoria felt her heart speed up. Did I mention that I wanted he raise my skirt and possess me on the table? Seemed to say a voice inside her mind. Gentlemen, I am deeply grateful for your love and your loyalty to me, and I am moved and proud of your gentlemanly gestures. But Cumberland must also know that he does not face a helpless girl but the legitimate monarch of proud British Empire. If necessary, he will prove that I am more worthy heir to my grandfather George than him, that he is a disgrace to his father and our lineage. If he wants my enmity, he will have it, and I will do everything possible to help mobilize the nation against him. We will see if there are choices between him and me. The British people prefer him to me. And see if the British will go to war against him happy if I ask them. And he will also see who has more influence in the courts of Europe, the Queen of the British Empire or the petty King of Hanover, who of the two is more important to the King of France, the Tsar of Russia, the Queen of Spain, the King of Prussia or the Emperor of Austria. No, my uncle Cumberland is going to find out that I am not a helpless girl, but an enemy that should be afraid, said Victoria, becoming a different person, a whole queen who squandered solemnity, dignity, and courage, and at that moment it would have been difficult to differentiate her from the image that history had built of her distant predecessor, Elizabeth I. Everyone saw her with respect, none thought it was a bravado of an immature girl emboldened by her throne, but it was the way of speaking of a formal head of state, of a constitutional monarch, whose power lay precisely in the influence that her image could project on her subjects. Lord Melbourne also saw her with pride, the pride with which a man saw the woman he loved and a mentor to his outstanding disciple. Some time later, near the end of breakfast, Lord Melbourne told Victoria that he was going to accompany George to the city. "And will it take a long time?" Victoria asked, a little anxious and upset. "I expected to spend all day with you. I have to make some very important negotiations, which are necessary for everyone, especially for you, and that I will explain you later. And you should also take advantage to hold a working audience with Peel. But believe me, I will also be anxious to get back to you, and I promise you that you will have me all day tomorrow," said Lord Melbourne, almost whispering and with an intense look of desire that shook Victoria. After breakfast, George, Lord Melbourne, and Victoria walked happily in the direction of the exit of the palace. "Lord George, I would love to thank you for what you did for my husband," with a personal gesture, Victoria said, smiling as she walked on the arm of Lord Melbourne. "I thank you, ma'am, but William is my brother and I would do anything for him without expecting anything in return," George answered cheerfully. "But perhaps there is a very beautiful gesture you can do for him. George has a daughter, a beautiful, sweet and intelligent girl who is a great admirer of you, who feels a special devotion for Queen Victoria, and I think for her to know you in person it would be the greatest dream of her short life," said Lord Melbourne cheerfully. "Really? She must be a lovely girl. Of course, I want to meet her," exclaimed Victoria, enchanted. "Majesty, I thank you very much," exclaimed George excitedly and with wet eyes. "Excuse me, George, I'm going to say goodbye in private to my dear wife," said Lord Melbourne with a wink. "Of course, with your permission, Your Majesty," George said, smiling and with an accomplice gesture. "Of course, Lord George, but, Lord M, what?" Victoria said, a little confused and funny. Lord Melbourne took her by the arm and, opening a door, he entered with her into a small room nearby. Then he closed the door, and he put Victoria back against the door, and taking Victoria's small hands with his big hands made her stretch her arms up and ducked his head and kissed her passionately on the lips. The kiss lasted as Lord Melbourne devoured Victoria's small mouth, nibbled on her lips and thrust his tongue into his wife's mouth, while she corresponded with her little tongue. Lord Melbourne held her immobilized against the door, kissing her, with Victoria's bulging belly creating some space between them. Finally, Lord Melbourne broke the kiss and rested his forehead against Victoria's forehead. "You do not know how hard it is to control me. When we were sitting at the table I just wanted to lift your skirt and make you mine on the dinner table," Lord Melbourne said in his deep voice full of lustful virility. "You too?" exclaimed Victoria, excited and surprised. "You wanted me to make love to you on the table? My wicked little girl!" exclaimed Lord Melbourne, and both burst into laughter, and then kissed on their lips again. "God! I would like to take you right now to the bedroom, take off all your clothes and go inside you again and again, and make love to you until I'm exhausted," he added later. Lord Melbourne put his hands on Victoria's bodice and squeezed gently, making Victoria gasp. Lord Melbourne saw with lust the neckline of his wife's dress. "One of the advantages, that you are with child, is that your breasts grow a lot, and that makes them more appetizing to taste them with my mouth and caress them with my hands," Lord Melbourne said with malice. "Oh, Lord M, I cannot wait," Victoria replied, horny, and almost crying with desire. "Believe me, my love, for me it is more difficult," exclaimed Lord Melbourne, feeling the painful erection of his cock visible in the crotch of his pants. "But tonight, you will be all mine. You will be my young female wolf in heat, and I will be your stallion, your old and beautiful wolf eager to mate with you," added with a mocking smile. Wolves? What are you talking about, Lord M? Victoria replied laughing. It does not matter, later I explain you. You should only know that tonight, I'm going to make you howl. You will howl at the moon like a wolf while I possess you, while I enter your body and make love to you while my hands squeeze your non-stop breasts. I want to make you mine until I'm out of breath, Lord Melbourne said with desire and kissed her again with passion. A few minutes later, Lord Melbourne and George were at the bottom of the staircase that led to the front door of the palace, and Lord Melbourne laughed at the mischievous and mocking eyes of his friend George. What's the matter, George? Lord Melbourne asked funny. Nothing, just thinking about how much a man changes when he is happily in love, undergoes an incredible transformation, a transfiguration, and what is the man in love doing today? Said George funny and mocking. The first thing I have to do is visit the Prussian embassy. I must extend an invitation to the ambassador, an old acquaintance of mine, Lord Melbourne replied with a dark, determined, and intriguing gesture on his face. More than a week later, at his royal palace in Hanover, Uncle Cumberland waited impatiently in his throne room, which looked ridiculous in comparison to Victoria's throne room at Buckingham Palace. Suddenly the door opened and a tall, thin man with grey hair and elegant appearance entered. He was the British ambassador in Hanover. I came as quickly as possible, Your Majesty, said the ambassador in a friendly tone. And even so, you are retarded to my call. Cumberland exclaimed with disdain and fury, without showing the respect that a head of state should show for a foreign ambassador, behaving rather as he was doing in Britain with crown officials, being a member of the British royal family. Anyway, let's not waste any more time. I guess you are informed of movements of troops of the Prussian army near the border with Hanover, added Cumberland. Well, I've heard something, but I've barely had time to study the reports well, sir, replied the ambassador, hiding behind his cold and serene diplomat mask the contempt he felt for Cumberland and the extensive and detailed knowledge he had of those movements. Well, you should be better informed. My agents have informed me that they are movements of large contingents of troops, involving many men and abundant war material, and the worst thing is that they were clearly making essays of an invasion of Hanover. This is an intolerable threat to my kingdom. Cumberland exclaimed furiously. Excuse me, Your Majesty, but I'm a little confused. Should not you have summoned the Prussian ambassador to demand explanations and file a formal protest? Replied the ambassador, hiding the sarcasm and, above all, the pleasure of the fear he saw in Cumberland. You are exclaimed Cumberland, repressing the insult he was going to say to the ambassador. That can wait. Here the important thing is to know what England intends to do. What does the Peel government intend to do in the face of this threat? He added. Excuse me, Majesty, should I understand that you are asking that Her Majesty's government intervene in a conflict between Prussia and Hanover? The ambassador asked with an expressionless gesture and a tone of cold courtesy. Cumberland's face was covered with surprise and anger. Of course. Do I have to remind you of the British commitment to Hanover? A commitment that has existed for more than 100 years when an elector of Hanover left this country to occupy the British throne. One of my ancestors and of my niece Victoria. Should I instruct a British ambassador in Hanover about it? So low has the quality of the British foreign affairs officials fallen. Cumberland replied wrathfully. Yes, the British commitment to Hanover. The ambassador said, reflectively, ignoring Cumberland's insult, well, Majesty, that issue has been discussed recently in Sir Robert's cabinet, and I must tell you that this commitment is being reconsidered, considering that already the crowns of Great Britain and Hanover are not lodged in the head of the same person, added the ambassador. Are you implying that the British crown would allow a Prussian invasion of Hanover without intervening militarily? Cumberland asked, standing up, indignant. There is no decision about it, Majesty. I'm just saying that Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel and members of his cabinet are considering all points of view on this. But do not worry, we can ask Lord Melbourne to intercede with the Prussians, said the ambassador calmly but with a twinkle in his eyes. Lord Melbourne. exclaimed Cumberland, impacted. Yes, the consort of our Queen has a fluid relationship with the Prussian ambassador in London and in recent days has invited him to dine with him and Her Majesty the Queen several times. Besides, Lord Melbourne exchanges letters with Karl Friedrich Heinrich von Weylich und Lotham, which, as you know, is the closest thing that exists to a prime minister in the Prussian government. And Her Majesty Queen Victoria wrote an extensive and cordial letter to the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, just a week ago, who, having recently ascended to the throne, is eager to have a good relationship with our Queen, as he demonstrated in his reply to that letter. Of course, all this with the knowledge and agreement of Prime Minister Peel, said the ambassador. Cumberland was livid with anger and fear. What does all this mean, ambassador? Cumberland said in a voice broken by anguish and anger. I think it means that Her Majesty the Queen, her consort, and the Prime Minister can use their good relations with the Prussian King and his closest advisors to relax the tension. I would not even be surprised if tomorrow Prussian troops withdraw and return to their regular locations and all this has been no more than a rehearsal, war games. But it also means that very likely the appeasement of the Prussians and therefore the peace and security of Hanover depend on everything going well in London and that nothing jeopardizes the stability of our country, especially the ability of our Queen to intercede before the Prussian court. I think that's what it means, said the ambassador with that way that diplomats have, to present threats without appearing as such, disguised with a courteous language. Later that day, Cumberland gave orders to his agents in London to disband the group of assassins he had hired at a high price and to dispense with their services. His perverse plans against Victoria and Lord Melbourne were definitively dead. A couple of days later, a young man, just over 30 years old, tall and thin, but somewhat muscular, blonde, and with a thick mustache, walked through the courtyard of a Hanover prison, escorted by soldiers. The man was chained hand and foot, wearing dirty and torn clothes, with a shirt that had been white and now looked almost black with grime and brown pants also filthy and torn. The man's face was covered in bruises, the product of several strong blows received in recent days. One eye was almost closed by the swelling produced by a brutal blow and the dried blood was around his broken nose and swollen lips. Through the broken shirt looked the marks of the whipping that the man received on his back, brutal whipping that left his skin disfigured. The man was placed with his back against a wall of the prison and in front of him was a squad of soldiers in horizontal formation. It was a firing squad. The man recalled the scene a few days before when he was standing in front of a group of officers dressed in pompous dress uniforms and sitting side by side on a more or less long table. The scene occurred in a room where, apart from him and the men sitting at the table, there were only 2 soldiers with their rifles who were there as their jailers. A bald and elderly man who was right in the middle of the group of officers spoke in German. Captain Ludwig Schulz, this court-martial finds you guilty of the crimes of cowardice and treason by failing to protect with your life with His Majesty Ernest Augustus, King of Hanover, and we, therefore, sentence you to the death penalty by shooting, in addition to dishonorably discharged from the Hanover army, being degraded and deprived of the rank of captain, and of all the inherent honors, including the decorations of which a coward is not worthy, said the president of the court. Marshal. Now Ludwig stared in terror at the soldiers of the firing squad, while tears ran down his face. There was no longer any trace of arrogance in him, only fear of death and emotional suffering, for the terror he felt was worse than the tortures to which the Cumberland thugs subjected him, the same ones who tortured the students, intellectuals, men of business, men and simple peasants or workers who were imprisoned in the dungeons for opposing in some way the tyranny of Cumberland. Ludwig refused the bandage offered to cover his eyes and then looked up to see Cumberland watching the scene from a window on a high floor. Please, Majesty, forgive me. I did not want to fail you. At least forgive my life and let me live in shame. He cried desperately. Cumberland looked at him scornfully. Ready! Shouted the officer who commanded the peloton. Ludwig's whole body trembled violently, as he kept crying. Aim! The officer shouted with his sword raised, and all the soldiers pointed their rifles at the poor wretch in front of them. Ludwig urinated on his pants of fear, a final shame with which his own body betrayed him, a fact that would reinforce his image as a coward. "Fire!" the officer shouted, lowering his sword, and a fusillade volley rumbled in the prison yard, while clouds of smoke issued from the barrels of the rifles. The discharge of lead bullets flew in the direction of Ludwig, and several hit him in the chest and legs, lifting pieces of skin and drops of blood. The man fell backwards, to the floor, his chest covered with red holes in his shirt, which they grew while the blood drenched the entire fabric. A trickle of blood came from Ludwig's mouth, who nevertheless still lived, with his eyes wide and breathing difficult. The officer who gave the order to shoot approached him with a pistol in his hand. "Mama," was the last word that Ludwig pronounced. The officer fired the gun at Ludwig's head, and his brain and blood flew through the air. After the silence, from the window, Cumberland snorted scornfully and turned to see an assistant. "Do you remember that the mother of that coward wrote to me begging me to spare her son's life? Send her the body and tell her that that is my answer. Also tell her that if she begins to tell everyone why her son died, that she remembers that she still has 2 other children who may suffer the same fate. So better she keeps the mouth shut or prepare to suffer the consequences," Cumberland said threateningly. "Yet, Majesty," answered the assistant. "Someone had to pay for the insult, someone must be suffered my wrath," Cumberland said furiously, and then left walking quickly. "They would be had to be Victoria and Melbourne, but since they cannot be, I suppose the price of happiness of one's is the tragedy of others," Cumberland said in a low voice while talking to himself. The vase and sword incident had a tragic epilogue. I invite all my viewers to click on the link to this site. I invite you all to join me on this site, where I will start publishing unpublished stories of mine that will have the same components of my fanfics that you like so much. And I ask you to join and collaborate with me to make my dream come true, and recommend the site to your friends and family. Thank you. And do not forget to join our group too.